You are standing in a stone chapel high in the mountains of northern Ethiopia. A monk lifts a wooden cover. Inside is a book. Goatskin pages, painted gold and red, faces staring back at you across 15 centuries. You are told it is old. You are not told how old. And when a laboratory in Oxford finally ran the numbers, the answer did not just surprise the experts, it broke the timeline they had built their entire field on. Here is the claim I am going to prove to you tonight. This book, hidden in a monastery almost no outsider has ever entered, may be the oldest illustrated Christian manuscript on the face of the earth. And if the dating is right, then the story of when and where Christian art was born has been told backward for more than 1,000 years. That is what the modern reanalysis revealed. That is what a small circle of scholars quietly confirmed, and the textbooks still have not caught up to. I want you to remember one anchor as we go. The year is 2010. The place is the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit, and the man who forced this test to happen is a French scholar named Jacques Mercier. What he found is not legend. It is a lab result, printed, dated, and traceable. Stay with me, because by the end you will understand why the monks believe the man who made this book finished it in a single day. I have chased a lot of dead ends in my life, but I still remember the night I first read the Oxford date range out loud to myself, sitting at my desk at 2 in the morning, and actually said, no, that has to be a typo. It was not a typo. And once I understood it was not, I could not put this case down. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a monastery called Abba Garima. It sits near the town of Adwa in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, close to the border with Eritrea. The monastery, by its own tradition, was founded in the year 494 by a man the Ethiopians call Abba Garima. He was one of a group history remembers as the Nine Saints, holy men who came from the Roman world into the Ethiopian highlands to spread Christianity. And the story attached to Abba Garima is the kind of thing you file under pious legend and move on. They say he copied the entire Gospels in a single day. They say that when the light began to fade and he was not finished, he prayed, and God held the sun still in the sky until the last word was written. For centuries, that was all it was. A beautiful story. A book in a box in a remote church. Scholars who did manage to glimpse it assumed it was medieval, made maybe around the year 1100, which already made it precious, but not revolutionary. That was the official story. That is the story I am now going to take apart piece by piece, the same way I did in my own notes, until you see why it cannot stand, because the first crack in that story is the object itself. There are actually 2 books at Abba Garima, and researchers call them Garima I and Garima II. Both are written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia. Both are illustrated. And both contain something that stopped me cold when I first saw the plates. Portraits of the 4 evangelists, full color, architectural canon tables, those decorated arches that early Christians used to cross-reference the Gospels, and in Garima II, an image of a stepped, roofed structure that a number of scholars believe may be the earliest surviving painting of a church building interior anywhere in the Christian world, not one of the oldest. Possibly the oldest, full stop. Now hold that thought, because if this book is medieval, an image like that is interesting but ordinary. If this book is something else, that image becomes one of the most important pictures in human history. Everything depended on the date, and for centuries, nobody had tested it. Therefore, the entire value of these books rested on a guess. That is where Jacques Mercier comes in. Mercier is a French scholar who spent decades studying Ethiopian religious culture, and he was one of the very few outsiders the monks trusted enough to work closely with these manuscripts. He suspected the old estimate was wrong. Not a little wrong, badly wrong. And he pushed over years for something no one had done before. He wanted a physical sample of the parchment sent to a laboratory for radiocarbon dating. That is the test where you measure the decay of carbon in organic material, in this case the goatskin the pages were made from, to find out when the animal actually died. You cannot argue with a dead goat. The parchment is exactly as old as the animal it came from. The samples went to Oxford. And when the results came back, The numbers did not match the medieval story at all. The radiocarbon dating placed the making of these Gospels somewhere between the year 330 and the year 650. Let me say that again slowly so it lands the way it landed on me. Not 1100. As early as the 4th century, the two books tested slightly differently, with one clustering in the earlier range, roughly 330 to 540, and the other slightly later, but both of them fell centuries before anyone had dared to guess. Suddenly, the pious legend, the monk who supposedly copied the Gospels around the time the monastery was founded in 494, was sitting right in the middle of the scientific date range. Think about what that means. The story said the founder made the book. The lab said the book was made in the founder's era. The legend and the carbon were pointing at the same moment in time. And this is the exact point where the boring explanation begins to die. Let me pause here, because I know how you are thinking right now. I thought the same way. I am a skeptic by default. When someone tells me a remote monastery has the oldest anything in the world, my first instinct is that the claim is inflated, that the test was contaminated, that the excitement ran ahead of the evidence. So I want to walk you through every ordinary explanation, honestly, the way I worked through them myself, because if this survives your doubt, it will survive anyone's. The first ordinary explanation is contamination. Radiocarbon dating can be thrown off by later handling, by oils, by restoration materials, by candle smoke soaked into the pages over centuries of use in a working church. It is a fair objection. But here is the problem. Contamination from later centuries generally makes something test younger than it really is, not older. If anything, the risk was that these books would seem more recent than the truth. The lab was pushing against the direction of the surprise, and the dates still came back ancient. The second ordinary explanation is that they tested the wrong thing, or that the parchment was reused. Ancient scribes sometimes scraped old skins clean and wrote on them again, so maybe the skin was old but the writing was medieval, but this is where the art historians step in, and this is the part that gave me chills. The style of the paintings, the way the evangelists are drawn, the design of the canon tables, the specific decorative patterns, all of it belongs to late antiquity, to the same early centuries the carbon pointed to. The science and the art were agreeing. Two completely different methods, one measuring atoms and the other measuring artistic style, arrived at the same answer independently. That almost never happens. When it does, you stop calling it a coincidence. The third ordinary explanation is the easiest to reach for and the most important to break. Maybe it is old, sure, but so what? There were older Christian books elsewhere, in Constantinople, in Syria, in Egypt, and this is just a provincial copy that happened to survive. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable, except when you actually go looking for those older illustrated gospel books, the ones everyone assumes must exist, you run into a wall. The famous illuminated Gospels of the Byzantine world that survive intact tend to be later than this. The great early codices we do have are often plain text, not richly painted narrative books like these. So the Garima Gospels are not filling in a known picture. They are standing almost alone at the very beginning of the entire tradition of the illustrated Christian book. That is where my skepticism ran out of road. I kept trying to make this ordinary. The evidence kept refusing. If this case has already grabbed you the way it grabbed me, I want you to know there is a place to go deeper. I've spent years building out exactly this kind of investigation, cases where the official answer turns out to be the least interesting one, and I put the full framework into a series called First Threshold, Deep Signal, and Hidden Systems, available now for $97 at lostorigins.org. Link in the description. These are not summaries. They are the working files. The same way I actually think through evidence like the Garima dating, the art history, the survival chain, all of it laid out so you can follow the logic yourself and apply it to any mystery you encounter. If you want to stop taking the tidy version on faith, that is where you start. But now let me bring you back to the monastery, because the story gets stranger from here, because you have to ask how. How did a book this fragile, made of animal skin and vegetable pigment, survive in an open highland monastery for a millennium and a half, through wars, through invasions, through the raids of the 16th century when Ethiopian churches across the region were burned and looted, through fire, through damp, through the simple, slow rot that destroys nearly every book that old everywhere else on earth. Manuscripts this delicate do not survive 1,500 years by accident. Somebody protected them deliberately, generation after generation, in secret, and told almost no one what they truly had. And that is the thread I want to pull now, because when I followed it, the case stopped being a happy story about a rediscovered treasure and turned into something that genuinely unsettled me. Consider the condition these books were actually in when scholars finally examined them closely. For a long time, the two gospel books had been jumbled together, pages mixed, bindings failing, some sections in danger of being lost entirely. A British book conservator named Lester Capon was eventually brought in to help stabilize and repair them, working in extraordinary conditions because the monks would not allow the manuscripts to leave the monastery grounds. Let that sink in. This possibly oldest illustrated Christian book in the world could not be taken to a climate-controlled museum lab in London or Paris. The work had to come to the mountain. The book does not leave. The book has never really left. For 15 centuries, the rule has been the same, and the people who followed that rule are the only reason you can look at those painted faces today. So now, put the pieces on the table together the way I finally did. A book carbon dated to the 4th to 7th century, a style that matches, a founding legend that lines up with the science, a survival that should have been impossible and only happened because a chain of unnamed monks guarded it in silence, and an image inside it that may be the earliest of its kind ever painted. Any one of those is a strong story. All of them at once, pointing the same direction, is not something the tidy medieval explanation can hold. And here is the contradiction that I could not get past, the one that kept me up. If this is genuinely one of the earliest surviving illustrated gospel books on the planet, why is it not a household name? Why, when you think of ancient Christian treasures, do you think of European cathedrals and Middle Eastern deserts, and almost never of the Ethiopian highlands? The answer is uncomfortable. For most of the modern era, the scholarship that decided what counted as important was written in Europe, and it quietly assumed that the story of Christian art began in the Roman and Byzantine heartland and radiated outward. A masterpiece sitting in an African monastery did not fit that map. So it was noted, admired by the few who knew, and then left off to the side. Not destroyed, not exactly hidden, just not allowed to matter as much as it should. And the people who could have gone back, retested it decades earlier, and rewritten the textbooks largely did not, because the answer they expected was more comfortable than the answer the parchment was waiting to give. It took an outsider, Mercier, pushing for years, to finally force the test that changed everything. And even now, more than a decade after those results came back, most people who love ancient mysteries have never heard the name Abba Garima. That, to me, is the real cold case. Not that the book was lost, that the truth about it was available, testable, sitting there in goat skin, and the world simply chose not to look until one stubborn man made them. But I promised you a finale, and I have been holding the strangest piece back because it only makes sense now that you understand the date. When you accept that these Gospels were made in the 4th, 5th, or 6th century, something extraordinary happens to that architectural image in Garima II, the stepped structure with its roof and arches that I mentioned earlier. Scholars have long debated what it depicts, and the leading interpretation is that it is not a fantasy at all. It is a real building. Many researchers read it as a rendering of an actual church, possibly modeled on a specific early structure the painter knew, one of the round or stepped ceremonial buildings of that ancient world, which means this is not a symbol dreamed up by a medieval artist copying older copies. It is potentially an eyewitness. A painting made by someone close enough in time to have seen or to have spoken to people who saw the very kind of building where the earliest Christians in that land actually gathered. Do you understand what that gives you? A window, not a legend about the past. A picture of it, made from inside it, when the monks say, Abba Garima copied these words about Christ in a single day, with the sun held still above him, What the carbon dating tells us underneath the miracle is that the words on those pages really do reach back to the founding age of Ethiopian Christianity, to within living memory of the men who carried the faith up into those mountains. The last words about Christ that this tradition preserved were not written down 1,000 years later by someone guessing. They were set down at the source and then guarded in silence in a stone room for 1,500 years by people who never got their names in a single history book. And here is the detail that I keep coming back to, the one that surfaced in Mercier's work and in the conservation reports, and that almost nobody outside a tiny circle knows. The parchment itself, when they studied how it was made and prepared, points to a local production. This was not imported from Byzantium, finished and complete. The skins, the making, the craft belong to that highland world, which means the artistry, the gold, the painted faces, the earliest illustrated gospel we may have was not a gift handed down from the great centers of the empire. It was created there in Africa at the very dawn of the Christian book. The tradition everyone assumed flowed outward from Europe was already alive and fully formed with a brush in its hand on an Ethiopian mountain. That is the reveal that reorders the map. That is the thing the textbooks were built to overlook. Let me be careful and honest with you the way I have tried to be all along, because you deserve it. Radiocarbon dating gives a range, not a single certain year, and there is real scholarly discussion about exactly where inside that range each book falls. Nobody serious claims we can name the precise day, but the center of gravity of all the evidence, the carbon, the art style, the parchment, the founding tradition, the survival, pulls in one unmistakable direction, and that direction is far, far older than the world was told for 1,000 years. When Mercier presented these findings, the reaction among specialists was not skepticism, it was something closer to awe, because they knew what it meant. I started this investigation expecting to find an exaggeration. A remote monastery, an inflated claim, a romantic legend dressed up as science. I have found the opposite so many times now that I have stopped expecting the boring answer. Here, at Abba Garima, the legend and the laboratory shook hands. The monk who supposedly finished the Gospels in a single miraculous day turns out to belong to exactly the era when these Gospels were truly made. The story was not covering up the truth. The story was carrying it in code across 15 centuries, waiting for someone with a carbon accelerator to finally decode it. So this is what I want you to walk away holding tonight. Somewhere in the mountains near Adwa, behind a wooden cover, in a room the outside world was almost never allowed to enter, there is a book that quietly rewrites when Christian art began and where it was born. It was not lost, it was kept, and the people who kept it asked for nothing, claimed no glory, and simply refused, generation after generation, to let those painted faces disappear. The truth was never missing, it was guarded. And it took one relentless outsider and a laboratory in Oxford to prove that the monks had been right about the age of their treasure all along in the only language the modern world would finally believe. If you have made it this far, then you are exactly the kind of person I make these for. The kind who hears the phrase everyone already knows the answer and feels the hair stand up on the back of your neck because you have learned, like I have, that the easy answer is so often just the answer nobody bothered to test. You do not accept the tidy version. You reopen the box. So here is my question for you, and I genuinely want you to answer it, because I read that image in Garima too, the stepped structure that may be the oldest painting of a church interior ever made. Do you believe the painter was drawing a real building he had seen with his own eyes, or a memory passed down to him, or something else entirely? Tell me what you think it is. Drop it in the comments below, and while you are there, tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight, because I love seeing how far these mysteries travel. And if you refuse to let a case stay closed just because someone official stamped it solved, then you already belong here with the rest of us who keep pulling these threads. Stay close, because the next book I am opening is a manuscript that was found sealed inside a wall, written in a language no one has ever been able to read, and the last person who claimed to translate it vanished before he could publish a single line. That one, I promise you, does not have a comfortable answer either. But before you go, let me leave you with the pieces I could not fit anywhere else, because they have haunted me since I first assembled this file, and I think they will haunt you too. There is a question I never fully answered, and it is this. Who was the painter? Not Abba Garima the legend, but the actual human hand that mixed those pigments and drew those unblinking evangelist faces. We do not know his name. We will almost certainly never know it, but we know things about him from the work itself, the way a detective reads a crime scene. He understood proportion. He knew the visual language of late antiquity, the framing, the arches, the symbolic color. He had access to gold. He worked with a confidence that does not come from copying blindly, but from belonging to a living tradition that already knew what it was doing. That is the part that unsettles me most. A confident, fully formed artistic tradition in a place the standard history told us was only receiving Christianity, not shaping it. The hand that made this was not a student on the edge of the Christian world. He was a master at its beating heart, and the map we were handed simply left his mountain blank. And then there is the survival itself, which I still cannot fully make peace with. Think about everything that had to not happen for you to see these pages. The manuscripts had to survive the campaigns of the 16th century, when the general history remembers as Ahmad Grand swept through the region and churches burned by the hundreds. They had to survive the ordinary enemies of every old book, the insects, the humidity of a highland rainy season, the smoke of centuries of candles and incense, the simple handling of countless services. They had to survive being taken apart, mixed together, and nearly lost through sheer neglect, until a conservator climbed the mountain to save them. Every single generation of monks could have been the one that let them slip away. None of them were. That is not luck. That is 1,500 years of deliberate, quiet, unbroken guardianship by men who understood they were holding something the world could not replace, even when the world had entirely forgotten to ask. I have spent a long time in the company of mysteries that turned out to be hollow, claims that collapsed the moment you pressed on them. This one is the opposite. Every time I pressed, it grew heavier, more real, more impossible to explain away. The carbon held. The art held. The parchment held. The legend, astonishingly, held. And underneath all of it sat a truth so simple it is almost painful. The people closest to the object were right about it the whole time. It took the rest of us 15 centuries and a machine in Oxford to catch up to what a monk in a stone chapel could have told you on the first day. So the next time someone hands you the finished, official, settled version of any story, I want you to remember the book Near Adwa. Remember that the answer everyone accepted was off by 1,000 years, and the only thing standing between the truth and oblivion was one stubborn scholar, one laboratory, and a chain of nameless men who refused to let the light go out. The box is never as closed as they tell you. You just have to be the one willing to lift the lid. If you're still with me, here's where this goes next. Inside the Unexplained Society, I continue this very video, the full Oxford dating case, sample by sample, picking up right where tonight left off. Ask me your own questions, and a real person, me, answers you myself. And you won't be alone. You belong here with fellow mystery lovers. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime. One click. Now let me show you something just as remarkable. Deep inside the site, long believed to be Noah's Ark, researchers finally reached what was hidden within, and what they found is stranger than anyone imagined. It's starting right here.